They had given freely and asked nothing in return. At first glance, this seemed merely puzzling, an almost incomprehensible allocation of resources for no strategic gain. Some delegates theorized it was a form of primitive religious practice, or perhaps an expression of the emotional volatility that seemed to govern so much of human behavior. But when analysts began plotting the distribution of human aid against historical records of political stability, a pattern emerged that turned puzzlement into something colder and more serious. Every species of humans had helped still existed. Every civilization that had moved against human allies, through aggression, through exploitation, through the casual cruelty that stronger species sometimes visited upon weaker ones, had subsequently collapsed. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, always completely, and always under circumstances that resisted clean explanation. A sole survivor from the destroyed PYR Confederation was eventually located, adrift in an unpowered escape pod on the far side of the Helix Nebula. He had been floating there for 6 months. His testimony, delivered in a voice scraped raw by fear and dehydration, was disjointed and at times incoherent, but its core was consistent. Human ships had appeared without warning in the hours after the Confederation's attack on a world under their protection. No ultimatums were issued. No negotiations were offered. A single message was broadcast on all channels, in every language the humans had learned to speak. You have attacked those under our protection. Then the PYR fleet had ceased to exist. The Council's first instinct was to classify the testimony as trauma-induced delusion, but the ancient security seals have been opening automatically for hours now. Layers of archival encryption millions of years old dissolving in response to whatever signal was approaching from beyond the rim. And what was emerging from those archives was rewriting everything the Council thought it knew about the galaxy it governed. The name, when it finally resolved across every Council display in letters that seemed almost reluctant to form, translated the same way in every language. Not a word so much as a concept, a sound that carried its own weight. The Null. In the fragmentary records that survived from before the first Extinction War, the Null were described in terms that other species reserved for natural disasters, not as an enemy to be fought, but as a condition to be survived, the way one survived a supernova or a plague. They did not conquer worlds. They erased them, methodically, completely, without malice and without mercy, the way a tide erases writing in the sand. Oceans boiled into vapor. Atmospheres were stripped away to bare vacuum. Entire biospheres, billions of years of accumulated life, of evolution and complexity and the small, specific beauty of things that had learned to exist in one particular place, were reduced to scorched stone and silence. No survivors. No ruins. Not even the memory of what had been, because the Null left nothing behind that could remember. Ancient empires had united against them in a conflict so vast and so costly that its full history had been deemed too dangerous to preserve. Thousands of species had fought together in what archivists call the First Extinction War, sacrificing entire star regions to build the gravitational barriers that finally, after centuries of unimaginable loss, trapped the Null beyond the void's edge. The records ended there, sealed behind encryption that was meant to last forever. It had lasted millions of years. Now the Null were returning, and they were not moving randomly through space. They were traveling along a precise vector, a straight, deliberate line aimed at the center of human space, following a path marked by beacons that humanity had apparently been seeding to the deep void for longer than the Council had known humans existed. Emergency transmissions flooded Earth's communications channels. The Council spoke with a desperation it had never permitted itself before, abandoning protocol, abandoning the carefully maintained language of diplomatic distance, asking the same question in 100 different ways. What have you done? What are you doing? What is coming? Earth did not respond. Instead, human satellites began activating across the outermost edges of their system. Not communications arrays, not observation platforms, but something else. Something that formed patterns across the dark that the Council's most advanced analysts couldn't classify because the energy signatures didn't match anything in the known technology database. They were ancient, they were precise, and they were clearly defensive in nature. Then a signal was detected drifting from deep space. Not from the approaching Null fleet, but from a beacon so old that its materials had predated the Council itself, dormant for millions of years. now awake. Its identification tag carried information in a language so archaic it took 6 hours to translate. Human distress signal. Acknowledged. The chamber did not fall silent so much as it was emptied of sound. The way a room empties when something is understood that cannot be taken back. Humanity had not called the Null. The Null had answered a call that humanity had made before recorded history, an SOS from a primitive civilization on the edge of a war it couldn't have comprehended, broadcast into the dark by people who had somehow understood that something in the dark might listen. And something had. The weeks that followed were the closest a Galactic Council had come to dissolution since its founding. Trade routes collapsed as merchant fleets refused to travel. Outer colonies flooded the jump corridors with refugee convoys. Worlds emptying themselves of everyone who could afford passage inward. Species that had maintained Cold War rivalries for centuries found themselves huddled together in the same desperate conversations, because the thing that was coming didn't care about their rivalries. It didn't care about anything. The Null fleet had slowed at the boundary of human space. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply gathered, an accumulation of dark vessels so vast that they occluded the stars behind them, blotting out entire constellations from perspective of nearby systems. They waited with the patience of something that did not experience time the way living things did. They waited, and that waiting was somehow worse than an attack would have been. Civilizations that had once sent delegations to Earth with barely concealed condescension now sent transmissions with something far more honest in them. Ancient rivalries were abandoned. Titles were forgotten. The elaborate formal language of interstellar diplomacy fell away, replaced by something rawer and more human, as if the approaching darkness was stripping away everything that wasn't essential. The question they asked was always the same. Will you protect us? Earth did not answer. Days passed. The silence from humanity felt different now than it had at the beginning of the crisis. Not contemptuous, not oblivious. Deliberate. It was a silence of people who were waiting for something specific, watching for something, and who would act when they chose to act and not before. That realization, that humanity was not paralyzed or patient, was somehow the most unsettling thing the Council had encountered in any of this. Then, through the cascade of urgent military signals and panicked civilian broadcasts and high-priority governmental transmissions that was clogging every communication channel in the galaxy, a single weak signal cut through. Not from a government, not from a fleet, from a small agricultural settlement near the frontier, a cluster of habitation domes and greenhouse structures on a world so far from any defensive position that evacuation had become mathematically impossible hours ago. The signal was unencrypted and unprofessional and broadcast on the most basic open channel available, because whoever sent it had no other way to reach anyone. The voice was a child's, young enough that her accent was still more home colony than galactic standard, still rough around the edges of words too big for her. She was frightened. She didn't pretend she wasn't. If anyone can hear us, please, please help us. We're still here. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Null fleet continued its vigil at the edge of human space. The galaxy held its breath. Then Earth answered, not with words, with light. Human warships emerged from positions hidden throughout the solar system and beyond. Vessels that had been running dark and silent for weeks, invisible to even the Council's most sensitive instruments, waiting. They were enormous. They were numerous. And they powered up in formation with a precision that spoke of rehearsal, of preparation, of a civilization that had been expecting exactly this moment and had spent considerable time deciding how it would respond. Their hulls bore no symbols of conquest or imperial authority. Instead, they broadcast a signal on every frequency, a simple, repeating pattern that every species in the galaxy recognized from its own darkest history. A protection signal. We stand between you and what comes for you. The human fleet did not charge toward the Null. It moved outward, between the gathering darkness and the worlds that were still trying to run, extending itself across the void like a hand placed against a door. A shield, not a sword. Not yet. Billions watched what happened next. Across the galaxy, on every world with the technology to receive the feeds being broadcast from observation satellites near the front, people gathered in the streets and in living rooms and in government chambers, watching in a silence that felt collective and enormous. The Null moved first. Their formation advanced like weather, not the dramatic, explosive violence of conventional warfare, but something slower and more absolute, a wall of darkness consuming distance with the patience of geological time. They were not hurrying. They had never needed to hurry. The cold energy they unleashed when they finally opened fire did not burn or blast. It simply unmade. Where it touched, matter ceased to exist in any recoverable form, collapsing into configurations of nothing that the laws of physics didn't have language for. The human line did not break. Something moved through the fleet then, not a command, not a tactical order, but something quieter, a decision, distributed across thousands of ships simultaneously. And the ancient things woke up. Satellites that had drifted in the deep dark for millions of years ignited. Defensive platforms unfolded from asteroids no one had thought to examine, revealing architectures that belonged to no known engineering tradition. Energy grids expanded across entire sectors, linking together into patterns so complex and so vast that they could only have been designed by something that understood the shape of space-time at a fundamental level. The Council's analysts watched their instruments and didn't speak, because there were no words for what they were seeing that didn't sound like myth. Then humanity fired back. The weapons didn't burn. They didn't detonate. They erased, reaching out across the dark with precision that was almost gentle, and removing Null vessels from existence with completeness that left nothing behind. Not debris, not energy signatures, not even the absent shape of things that had been. One moment a vessel existed. The next, it simply didn't, and the space it had occupied was exactly as empty as if it had never been filled. Shock propagated through the Null formation. The advance faltered, haltingly, then dramatically, vessels at the leading edge pulling back as the calculation changed. For the first time in millions of years, in the long memory of a species that had erased civilizations the way others prune gardens, something had given them reason to recalculate. The human fleet surged forward, not in anger, not in revenge or celebration, or any of the emotional registers that other species might have expressed in that moment. They moved with something quieter than any of that, a focused, relentless purpose, the specific gravity of people who had decided what they were willing to do and were simply doing it. They drove the Null back across the boundary of known space, through the void, to wherever the ancient barriers still held, and they pursued them until the last dark vessel's signal vanished from every sensor in the galaxy. Then they stopped and turned around and came home. The silence that followed the battle was different from the silence that had preceded it. The earlier silence had been the silence of dread, tightly wound, expecting rupture. This was a silence of exhaled breath, of a tension so long sustained that its release left something like wonder behind. It took the Galactic Council 7 days to issue their new universal directive, because the deliberation required was extensive and the language needed to be precise. Every empire, every republic, every federation and principality, and loose collection of systems that recognized council authority signed it. Even those who didn't, who had long maintained independent status, sent their own acknowledgments in their own language, saying the same thing. The directive was brief. It did not require elaborate justification. The galaxy had just watched its own history rhyme, and everyone who had seen it understood what it meant. Never threaten humanity, not because they are powerful, though they are, not because they are dangerous, though they are that too, but because humanity does not stand alone, and they never have, on Earth. The day after battle, it rained in most of the northern hemisphere. People stood in it, in the streets of old cities and new ones, faces turned up to the sky that had held the same stars for all of their history. In agricultural settlements near the frontier, a child who had broadcast her voice across the galaxy fell asleep in the early evening, not knowing what her words had done. In the deep archives of the Galactic Council, slowly, one by one, the remaining seals on the pre-extinction war records dissolved. The full history of the first extinction war was still fragmentary, still incomplete, still marked by the deliberate erasures of people who had thought some knowledge too dangerous to keep. But one passage survived intact in a dozen independent archives, recorded by a war archivist at the end of a battle that should have been impossible in a solar system that should have fallen. Do not interfere with Sol. Do not provoke the defenders. They endure in ways we do not understand. They protect things we thought unpossessable. And when darkness comes, They are the line it cannot cross. The archivist had not explained how. No one ever had. Perhaps it was because the answer was simpler than anyone looking for expected. Simpler than technology. Simpler than ancient alliances. Simpler than the weapons that have been sleeping in asteroids for millions of years. A child's voice, trembling but clear, carrying across the dark. If anyone can hear us, please. And humanity, hearing it, answering, as they always had, as they always would. That, in the end, was a thing that darkness couldn't cross. Deep space had always been silent, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of age, vast, indifferent, and ancient beyond reckoning. Across its endless dark, thousands of civilizations had risen, flourished, and carved their names into the fabric of the galaxy through conquest, commerce, and careful diplomacy. They traded in rare minerals and exotic technologies. They fought small, surgical wars over border systems and resource rights, wars that barely disturbed the greater balance of things. And at the center of it all sat the Galactic Council, a gathering of the oldest, most powerful species in the known universe, presiding over the slow, complicated business of civilization, like a court that had forgotten it was ever afraid of anything. They had received every kind of transmission imaginable over the millennia, requests for protection from fledgling worlds, desperate pleas for trade agreements from struggling colonies, cries for mercy from civilizations ground beneath the heel of stronger ones. The Council had heard it all, categorized it all, and responded according to procedure. They were not cruel, precisely. They were simply accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in the room, which was why, when a signal arrived from the small blue planet on the outermost edge of map space, no one in the chamber recognized it for what it was. The message was brief. It was calm. It was almost polite in its simplicity. Leave our system. This is your only chance. Laughter rippled through the council chamber. Genuine, unguarded laughter, the kind that only comes when something strikes you as absurdly beneath consideration. Humans. They had been aware of this species for less than a century. A young civilization, barely crawling out of its own gravity well. Their starships were crude, cobbled together things that more advanced species privately found endearing in the way one finds a child's drawing endearing. Their technology lagged generations behind even the most modest council members. Their population was fractious and loud, perpetually at odds with itself over questions the rest of the galaxy had settled thousands of years ago. They were not a threat. They were barely a footnote. An invasion fleet was dispatched within the week. 47 warships, representing the combined naval authority of 3 council member species. More than enough firepower to pacify an entire star cluster, let alone a single inhabited world. The operation was expected to conclude within one planetary cycle. A show of force, a formal annexation, and then the business of cataloging Earth's resources could begin in earnest. The fleet entered the Sol system and disappeared. Not destroyed in the way fleets were destroyed. No cascading explosions lighting up long-range scanners. No debris fields spinning to the void. No automated distress beacons crying out in the dark. They simply ceased to exist on any sensor in the galaxy. 47 warships and their combined crews of nearly 200,000 souls, gone as completely as if they had never been. For 3 days, the Council sat with the discomfort of that silence, telling themselves there were rational explanations. Sensor malfunctions, a localized spatial anomaly. Communication blackouts were not unheard of in uncharted systems. Someone would hear from the fleet. Someone always did. No one did. Then the second transmission arrived from Earth. We warned you. 2 words. The council chamber held them in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. And for the first time in longer than most delegates could remember, no one laughed. No one spoke at all for a very long time. The silence was broken not by words, but by alarms. Deep space sensors along the galaxy's outer rim flared simultaneously, registering an energy disturbance of staggering magnitude. Something moving to the void beyond the boundaries of known space. Something enormous and purposeful, and moving on a vector that corresponded precisely with the coordinates of Earth's solar system. Old classification algorithms buried in the Council's ancient databases stirred to life, cross-referencing the signal pattern against records so old that most of the archivists responsible for maintaining them hadn't known they existed. When the match resolved, the result was flagged in every language spoken in the council chamber simultaneously. Ancient, forbidden, erased from public history. And it was answering a human beacon. The intelligence sweep that followed was the most comprehensive the council had authorized in 300 years. Every data source was tapped, every agent network activated, every file report from the past century reviewed and cross-referenced. What emerged from that investigation was not the profile of a primitive, insignificant species fumbling toward galactic relevance. It was something else entirely, something that made several senior council delegates sit very quietly with the particular stillness of people recalibrating their understanding of the world. Humans, it turned out, had been traveling far beyond the mapped trade routes for decades, not in the sleek, heavily armed survey vessels that other species used to claim new territories, but in smaller ships, supply craft really, carrying food stocks and medical equipment and technical components. They had found their way to dying star systems that no empire bothered to save, to isolated worlds that had refused contact with the broader galactic community for generations, to the quiet margins where the vulnerable things lived.